All right. Good evening, everyone, and Happy New Year. I hereby open the work session of the Springfield Planning Commission. Could we have a roll call, please?
Commissioner McGinley,
Present.
Commissioner Landon,
Present.
Commissioner Koivula,
Here.
Commissioner Gill,
Present.
Commissioner Bergen,
Here.
Commissioner Salzar,
Present.
and Commissioner Buck.
Present.
Thank you.
Okay, this is Steve Dignam with the Lane County Planning Commission, and I hereby open our work session this evening, January 4th. Staff, can you do the roll call for us?
Yes.
Not hearing staff at this time, I will call roll. Steve Dignam, present. Betsy Schultz,
Present.
Charles C. Kaler,
Here.
Kathy Smith, absent. Christian Vitol,
Present.
Bruce Hadley,
I'm here.
Eliza Kaczynski,
Present.
Johnny Peacock, not seeing Johnny, and Stephen Snyder. I know I saw him. There he is.
Sorry, slow on the mute.
Great, thank you. As we begin our joint work session tonight, since we're in Zoom webinar, it's a little different. So I'd like to request that members of the Planning Commission keep their videos on so that attendees can see. They can't see you if your videos aren't on. Commissioner Schultz, we understand your situation, so don't worry. This meeting is a work session where the public may attend but not provide testimony. Later tonight during the joint regular session at 7 p.m., there will be a time for public comments. Our work session item tonight is the Springfield Development Code Update Project, and I will hand it over to Springfield City Attorney Christina Kratz for a brief statement regarding conflicts of interest.
Thank you, Chair. Commissioners may only have a potential conflict of interest regarding the Development Code Update Project because for both Springfield Planning Commission and Lane County Planning Commission, the future recommendations to the City Council and Board of Commissioners are not binding. Commissioners with potential conflicts of interest must disclose the nature of the conflict and then can participate in the work session. One example of a potential conflict of interest related to the Development Code Update Project is owning residential or commercial land in Springfield or inside the urban growth boundary of Springfield because property values could be affected by the proposed code changes. And at this time, it would be appropriate to ask Springfield Planning Commissioners to disclose whether they have any potential conflicts of interest.
Thank you, Christina. I'll start with myself, Commissioner McGinley. I do not own property within the city of Springfield or within the urban growth boundary, so I have no potential conflicts of interest. Vice Chair Landon.
I have a potential conflict of interest. I own property in Springfield.
Commissioner Koivula.
I own property in Springfield, so I have a potential conflict of interest.
Commissioner Gill.
I own property in Springfield and have a potential conflict of interest.
Commissioner Bergen.
Potential conflict of interest being a primary resident owner in Springfield, as well as practicing real estate broker in Springfield.
Commissioner Salazar.
I have two potential conflicts of interest, one that I own property in Springfield and the other that I work for a developer or real estate developer that operates in Springfield.
And Commissioner Buck.
Yes, I have two potential conflicts of interest. One, I own property in Springfield, and two, I work in the insurance industry and sell insurance in Springfield and the urban boundary.
Thank you, everyone. I'll hand it over to Chair Dignam.
Thanks. I think I would just, rather than calling individually, let me ask, are there Lane County Planning Commissioners that would like to report a potential conflict of interest? If so, please speak now.
Chair Dignam, this is Betsy Schultz, and I do have a couple potential conflict of interest. I do own an investment property in Springfield, and I just started a development company that may operate in Springfield.
Thanks, Betsy. Anybody else? Hearing none, that appears to be the end of our potential conflicts of interest.
Thank you. And I will now hand it over to City of Springfield Planning Staff, Mark Rust, and Lane County Planning Staff, Lindsay Eichner, for a staff presentation.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, Commissioners. Tonight's an exciting night for us. There's a whole group of staff here tonight that will, through the work session, we'll have a short presentation. I'm sharing my screen now, so hopefully you can see those slides all right. We'll have a more thorough slide presentation as part of the public hearing. Some of that will be a repeat of what you see tonight, but I'll take a brief minute and just introduce a couple of the other staff members from the City of Springfield to orient folks a little bit. I'm just going to go off my screen here. I'll just introduce myself first, though. I am Mark Rust. I've been the project manager of the Development Code Update project now for a little over 3 years. I've been with the City of Springfield for a little over 4. Previously, I was with Lane County Planning, working with Lindsay at the county, and I know a couple of the Lane County Planning Commissioners or have worked with you in the past. Other staff, Brenda is helping us tonight. Brenda is a great assistance on this project. Let's see, Christina Kraz, who you've met or seen, is Assistant City Attorney. She's been a huge part of the project team for this over the years. Arva Hussein is on the screen, as well as Katie Carroll. They have both served in the capacity of fellows from Portland State University. Arva is currently in that position. Katie was previously and is now Springfield City staff. Let's see who else I'm missing. Shannon Morris is on the call tonight. She's just tracking the project and helping us all with support as well. And then Tom Boyat, he's our director here at the City of Springfield. He's also monitoring the meeting tonight. There's Tom. Thanks, Tom. We do have a consultant with us on the meeting tonight as well, Elizabeth Decker from Jet Planning. Hi, Elizabeth. Thanks for being here. And I think that does it. Hopefully I didn't miss anybody. So with that, I'm going to go through this slide presentation. I'm hoping to leave the majority of the hour for questions from the commissioners. I am gearing this presentation primarily to the Lane County Planning Commission. The Springfield Planning Commission has been heavily involved in the development of the proposal and has been briefed in numerous work sessions over the years, most intensely over the summer and fall, with back-to-back work sessions working through a lot of the detailed code. So hopefully this work session will give the Lane County Planning Commission a pretty high level overview with the intent of bringing you up to speed on some of what we're doing with our code update project. So with that,
Hey, Mark.
Yeah.
Can I jump in with one quick comment?
Sure, that'd be great.
What you just said, because on page 3 of the City of Springfield packet, there's a comment at the top that says, quote, "This presentation will bring the Lane County Planning Commission up to speed on the amendments," et cetera, et cetera. I note, and you noted, that Springfield has met 10 times. So, I mean, we're all pretty quick learners over at Lane County, but to the extent you can really help us get up to speed, I feel like we're starting clearly from a long way behind where the Springfield Planning Commission already stands.
Right. I completely understand. I think thanks for pointing that out, Commissioner. And so I will try and get through this and then again, leave time for questions and we can have more dialogue or hopefully address some things. I think there'll be a lot of opportunity through the public hearing process as well to, get into more of the meat and details of what we're proposing as well. So I'm going to just a little bit of history. So this is the purpose of the project. the purpose statement, as well as the objectives of the project that I'll go over in a minute. These were discussed at our city council and approved as part of the community engagement plan for the project. Our planning commission, acting in their capacity as our committee for citizen involvement, approved the community engagement plan. Our city council really started talking about this project back in 2017, and then the project started in earnest late in 2018. I started working as the project manager with the project at that time in 2018. And then one of the first things we did was develop the community engagement plan, including this purpose statement, which I'm not going to read. You could all read for yourself. And then the part of that community engagement plan was also these objectives. Our city council direction was really recognizing that our existing development code as a whole is sorely outdated, having been primarily developed in the mid 1980s. So it's, decades old and really out of touch with development as it happens today for the most part. There's been a lot of band-aids put together to hold the code together over the decades. There have been some updates to implement new things that come along, new state laws. Marijuana dispensaries is an example of new sections that we've integrated into our code over time, but it's in terms of an overhaul of the entire code, it really hasn't happened in many decades. So our city council did direct us to undertake a complete overhaul of the code. We have proposed to phase this project. We're hearing about phases 1 and phase 2 tonight. They did prioritize as phase 1 housing, recognizing even back in 2017 that we were in a housing crisis, and that has only gotten worse, and really seeing housing as directly linked to economic development as well. And phase 2 is the employment lands part of our code dealing with the commercial and industrial zones, but they're really wanting to make the code easier to use, easier to implement, and allow development to happen in a more streamlined way. This is the timeline for the project. This is kind of this demonstrates the phases of the project to some degree. The yellow bars represent phase 1 of the project. That's the housing phase. These orange bars represent phase 2 of the project, the employment lands phase. These blue bars represent a future phase 3 that we are fondly calling the everything else phase that will come in the future to deal with other stuff that we haven't dealt with the initial 2 phases. A quick example of something we haven't tackled yet is our land division section of our development code, plus many other sections. But so this red line represents where we are here just at the beginning of 2022. This timeline has been adjusted over the years to account for integrating new state legislation that I'll talk in more detail about, as well as adjusting for the global pandemic that we're all living through and kind of reimagining how we do public outreach. So some adjustments in regard to that. One of the things I do want to highlight as part of this work session for the Lane County Planning Commission is some of the differences between, and I'm sorry if I'm sharing on the screen the view of all the people, if I'm screwing that up. I'm trying to juggle screens here. So the difference between the UGB versus the city limits. And I'm going to share a couple of maps here quickly. This map highlights all the medium density and high density residential zoned properties inside the existing Springfield city limits. This bolder dashed line around the perimeter is the urban growth boundary. It may not be really easy to make out. The pink line is the city limits, but there's some of these areas that are shown in basically white versus the really lightly shaded gray areas that delineate the difference between what's in the city versus outside the city limits inside the urban growth boundary. And I'll touch on why we're talking about the high density and medium density residential here in a minute as well. But just to give you some idea of scope of what we're talking about, the amount of these properties that are in those two zones that are inside the city limits is roughly probably around 2,000 properties. We mailed roughly 1,400 notices to these properties because there's multiple properties owned by the same owner. So the number of notices were less than the true number of properties. But these were triggered for what we refer to the ballot measure 56 notice. And I'll talk a little bit about that. In contrast, these are the properties that receive that notice that are outside the city limits. There's roughly 49 or 50 of them. And I had circles put on these different areas. There's about 7 different areas on this map that comprise the roughly 50 properties. So there's a small cluster of these lots up here. Hopefully you're able to see my cursor maybe on this map near the number 1. There's 1 or 2 properties here near this number 2, a cluster here at number 3, just a small number right here at the number 4, 2 here at number 5, small cluster at 6, and then at number 7. So again, these are medium density and high density residential zone properties outside the city limits, inside the urban growth boundary. So why this is significant is because one piece of our code update that triggers this ballot measure 56 notice is under state law. When a code change triggers a rezone of a property, and all this is talked in detail in the findings document that's included in the packet for tonight. But under state law, when something's considered a rezone, when we would limit the use of somebody's property, we're required to send this notice. So the use we're proposing to limit is no longer allowing single family homes, or what we're going to be calling single detached dwellings, single unit detached dwellings, on these medium density and high density zoned properties. Our current existing development code does allow single detached dwellings on these medium and high density residential zone properties if it's in accordance with the density standards and other development standards. But we're proposing to eliminate that use. And I can get into more detail probably in the public hearing part of discussion about why we're proposing to do that. But primarily it's proposing to utilize these limited number of medium density and high density residential lands for more intense development, for actual medium density and high density residential development, rather than having just one individual home be on them. So it would be more along the lines of duplexes, other multiplexes, townhome development, apartment complexes, those types of things. Excuse me, those types of developments. I'm going to keep going through this, and I hopefully again try and get through this pretty quickly here, and then have plenty of time for we can go back and revisit some of this if there's questions. So just again, really big picture or broadly, what are we proposing to do versus what the code update is not proposing to do? Again, I'm not going to read through all of this. When we originally set out to do this large code update, the new legislation that we'll talk a lot about tonight, later, and some now, is the middle housing legislation. House Bill 2001 came along, new legislation out of the state. It requires us as a city to now allow, the definition of middle housing includes duplexes, triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, and cottage cluster development. So those middle housing types now have to be allowed in what was previously our low density residential zone. We're proposing to call that now our R1 zone. So with the code update, originally didn't contemplate this new legislation at all because it didn't exist yet. So partway through already starting the development code update project, this new legislation came along and started to really kind of overshadow a lot of the bigger code update project because it took on a life of its own and has required much more work to implement than we originally envisioned with the initial code update. But so our city council did direct us to fully incorporate the House Bill 2001 into the ongoing process at that point. So a lot of the focus is on housing and this middle housing and the residential zones. It's required more changes than we originally anticipated. Initially, we didn't want to make, the council directed us not to try and remain policy neutral and not make drastic changes. It was just really trying to reformat and make our code easier to use. I'll also mention here one of the other requirements by state law that we needed to update our code to meet. It's an older state law that was already in place, is to have clear and objective standards for all housing. So that was another big part of the code update project originally, was to meet this clear and objective standard test for our housing approval standards. Then additionally, the employment land use, we have these antiquated lists, a very detailed lists of different types of employment and industrial and commercial uses. I don't have a good example for you, but you can imagine some of the antiquated type of industrial or commercial uses. And really, so we're proposing to now just generalize those into use categories instead of having these long detailed lists of uses that may no longer be applicable and that then aren't really flexible to recognize or acknowledge new types of uses that weren't included in these detailed lists. We're also talking about development standards, just updating and modernizing our development standards for height limits, setbacks, lot coverage, etc. The lot sizes we had to adjust and deal with to implement middle housing. And then we are proposing to remove the solar setback standards. As part of the process, there was a lot of public outreach that's detailed in the report that's included in the packet, the public outreach summary report. We did have technical advisory committees helping us that were composed of the public. I'll have lists of those in the slide presentation as part of the public hearing and more on the public outreach. But part of the initial stage of phase one with housing was conducting a housing code audit, which our consultant who's on the meeting tonight, Elizabeth Decker from Jet Planning, through a grant from the Department of Land Conservation and Development at the state, helped us conduct that code audit and identified the solar setback standard as a barrier to development. And so that was some of the reason for proposing to no longer include that component. Some of the things the code is proposing to not do. We're not proposing to update our permit or application fees at this point or adjust our systems development charges. The building code is completely separate from the land use code or the development code. So none of this has to do with how buildings are constructed in terms of the building code standards. So we're not proposing any modifications to building code requirements or fire code requirements. The infrastructure improvement standards, for the most part, stay pretty static. We do update a lot of the wording to help it be clear and objective to meet that requirement for our housing and how we implement our improvement standards for housing. I'll just finish the list. Stormwater requirements, and then also the wetland and floodplain standards. I will mention that a lot of these things are actually being worked on concurrently or envisioned to be updated. A couple of things I'll just mention, for instance, floodplain standards. We just updated our floodplain standards. It was just, I think, finally adopted by our city council last night. That was a separate process. The stormwater requirements are being dealt with separately. We have a new stormwater permit from the state that we're going to have to adjust our stormwater standards for through another separate process that will be coming. Systems development charges, there's new legislation going on at the state level that will likely be requiring us to look at or reevaluate our systems development charges, things like that. So it's not that these things aren't being dealt with, a lot of them are, it's just they're not as a part of this specific process at this time. So really quick, phase one highlights some of the key points of what phase one is dealing with. I mentioned the housing code audit. A copy of that audit report is in the packet. Adjusting or implementing clear and objective standards for housing, I mentioned. Implementing the new House Bill 2001 middle housing legislative requirements. Another new legislative requirement, even newer yet than The middle housing, House Bill 2001, was implemented in the 2019 legislative session. The expedited land divisions for middle housing is even newer yet, having just been implemented in the 2021 legislative session. Very quick turnaround times from the state mandating that we implement a lot of these new standards that we've incorporated into these changes along the way. Proposing to update our standards for certain uses. We can get into more detail about that. That's one section of our code. Short-term rentals was something that kind of came up as a result of looking at how we dealt with existing beds and breakfasts and boarding houses. Some of this came out of a requirement for also not regulating based on family status, another new piece of state legislation that's talked about in the memo, Senate Bill 8, I believe. So in looking at how we can no longer regulate by family or relational status, looking at bed and breakfasts and boarding houses, really just combining those two and into short-term rentals. And then our definitions section, really adding some definitions, updating other definitions. Phase 2 of the project, like I mentioned, is the employment land section, deals with the commercial industrial districts. I mentioned how we're implementing just broad use categories rather than very detailed lists. The procedures section of our code was included in this phase 2. However, it's applicable to all the different land use districts, including housing and residential. So if somebody submits for a residential subdivision, this process piece or the procedures section of the code would also be applicable to that. I have a flow chart in the next slide that kind of highlights our 4 different types of processes. Also, site plan review is a different type of process that is applicable to both potentially housing development as well as commercial and industrial development. So even though it's in phase 2 under employment lands, it is also applicable to housing. Somebody could apply for a site plan for an apartment building or something like that. The minimum development standards section of our code is kind of a mini site plan review. It's for a limited scope of certain types of development that can go through a much easier process than the site plan review. And so we modernized that process to streamline it as well. And then the development standards, which includes a whole host of different standards, but things like parking, landscaping, utilities, lighting. There's a bunch of new language and different modernized language on that. So the process flow chart, this kind of is a really general schematic of our, and I'm not sure how easy this is to see, but there's a type 1 process here. That is a very straightforward type of almost just your building permit submittal, no formal land use process. The type 2 is what under state law is the first type of application that would be considered an actual land use decision under state law, where a notice is sent and there's an opportunity to appeal. A lot of what we're doing with the clear and objective standards and how housing is required to be approved under state law is moving a lot of housing approval out of a type 2 process into a type 1 process to make it much easier. And again, state law requires us to basically allow it in that manner. So a lot of housing will now be approvable under a type 1 process with no notice to the surrounding property owners and no appeal opportunity. If all the approval standards are clear and objective as required by state law, there's no discretion needed to be used, and therefore nothing really in theory to argue about or base an appeal on, because it's either a yes or no type of answer to a question whether they meet the standard or not. Above the type 2 is where we get into a type 3 process, where it would go through more of a hearings type of process, more complicated. And then tonight's process, we're in a type 4 legislative. Type 3 can oftentimes be referred to as quasi-judicial in some cases, generally talking. And then type 4 is more of a legislative process. It's where it's not property specific. This code update is a type 4 legislative process. So with that, I think that's all the slides I have. I'm happy to go back and revisit any of those. Again, I know that was super high level and super quick, but I did want to leave plenty of time to talk in more detail about anything the commission wants to hear more about. And I'll just turn it over to you and happy to field questions.
Thank you, Mark. Commissioners, if you have any questions, please use the raise hand feature or wave your physical hand. I can't see everyone on my screen all at once, so I will look out for you. Is there anyone who has a question or comment for Mark? Commissioner Kaczynski.
Just looking a little bit at how these codes, particularly the lands that are outside of the city limits but within the UGB, do all of these code changes apply to those lands, or are some of them things that wouldn't really come into play until someone annexes or something like that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Commissioner, for that. And so it's really difficult to dissect out different parts of the code that would be applicable outside the city limits versus what would be inside the city limits. One of the clear delineating lines that I can use as an example, at least, is that the new middle housing provisions, as the legislation was written, do not apply outside city limits. So at least in terms of how we've incorporated middle housing, it's clear to us based on state law and the rules written to implement that new legislation that the middle housing provisions could not be applied or are not proposed to be applied outside the city limits. So an example is, I showed that map of properties outside the city. If somebody has, a quick example, middle housing requires us to allow a duplex on any lot that allows a single family home. So there's plenty of lots outside the city that have would allow a single family home. However, we would not have to allow that duplex on that lot outside the city. Now, if they chose to annex, then they are inside the city, then they could apply for that middle housing provision. Other than that, it gets really tricky to say these provisions apply versus these ones don't apply, because there's so many different scenarios of development that could happen outside the city. And one other example I'll mention, so out in the southeast part of Springfield is the Jasper Natron area, way out Bob Straub Highway. There's a pretty large area that's zoned for industrial use. However, for it to truly develop with industrial use, it would basically have to be annexed to the city to develop at urban industrial standards. However, there could be, say, a developer that wanted to master plan that industrial land for some kind of master plan industrial development that could potentially try and go through the master planning process while it was still outside the city limits. And so that type of process might come to this joint body of both planning commissions to do that master planning process, or they could choose to annex it first and then do the master plan. So the procedures section is a good example of, it's definitely that those procedures sections apply, whether it's in the city or outside the city. It just depends on what type of process somebody's proposing. The development standards themselves, like infrastructure and parking and things like that, again, they apply outside the city, but it really depends on a specific development scenario to determine when those would actually kick in outside the city limits. And I might defer to Christina Kraz, our Assistant City Attorney, for a second to help address part of that dynamic as well.
Yeah, so there's an overlay zone that is applied outside city limits inside the urban growth boundary that is called the urban fringe overlay, that those of you who have served on the Lake County Planning Commission for a while probably are familiar with. And that overlay limits the uses that are allowed before annexation occurs. And so a lot of commercial and industrial uses, as Mark described, are not allowed. There are certain types of utility facilities that are allowed to be constructed without annexing. The city of Springfield recently went through a process to evaluate a sub Springfield Utility Board substation, for example, and that was not entirely annexed, the property where that was being constructed. So there are definitely scenarios in which the procedures or the site plan review standards or minimum development standards could be applied outside city limits, but it will be a narrow group of developments since urban development requires annexation. One of the major changes that is designed to help be consistent with development that's allowed inside city limits is changing the urban fringe overlay standards, as Mark mentioned, to not allow new single family homes to be constructed on property that is zoned medium density residential or high density residential currently that is outside city limits. Right now, the code would allow someone who owns an MDR or HDR property that is not annexed potentially to build a new single family home on that property as long as they show the city a plan for how they're going to achieve urban densities later down the road. But since that housing type would not be permitted upon annexation, staff we've recommended that we also do not allow that housing type outside city limits to be constructed so that it's consistent, whether you're inside or outside city limits, the type of housing you can construct on an MDR or HDR property. For properties that already have a single family home and are zoned MDR or HDR, then obviously that home can remain. It becomes a non-conforming use. It can be continued. It can be expanded. You can still construct additions and that type of thing on your home. So it really should only affect someone who's wanting to potentially redevelop or additionally develop a property without annexing to the city.
Does that help answer your question, Commissioner? Was there any follow-up?
No, thank you. That was really helpful.
I saw Commissioner Dignam's hand right after Commissioner Kaczynski, so let's go Dignam, followed by Commissioner Hadley.
Thank you. I'd like to follow up on the last comments made by Christina regarding the MDR, HDR. So far, that seems to me to be one issue which really does impact our the citizens in that ribbon that Lane County is looking at. If I first, just to make sure I understand, Mark, if I understand what you said, there's 50-ish total properties in that ribbon outside city limits, inside the UGB, which could theoretically be impacted by these MDR, HDR changes. Is my recollection correct?
Correct. And I might defer to Lindsay as well. I think the list was 49 properties. Just to give you some scope in terms of, I mentioned the number, we sent roughly 1,400 notices, I think, to about 2,000 properties. We heard from about 20 of those, for 20 people in regard to the roughly 1,500 or 1,400 notices that we sent. My understanding from talking with Lindsay this morning is that out of the 50 notices the county sent to those properties, there haven't been any comments received at this point. So I don't want to misspeak, but if Lindsay, but yes, your understanding is correct.
Thanks, Mark. I'm happy to add to that. With the reducing the duplicated property owners, we actually noticed 27 individuals or companies. And Mark is correct, we did not receive any comments since that time.
So let me ask a follow-up then. Perhaps you can describe in a little more detail the types of properties amongst those 49. I mean, if I'm a property owner there and I currently have a half acre of undeveloped land, I will no longer, after this update is passed, should it be passed, be able to put a single family residence on that half acre undeveloped lot that I've owned for 50 years?
That's correct. I mean, your understanding is correct. So, you know, a lot of times if somebody has say sat on a half acre of medium density residential land for however long, they may be envisioning it as their retirement property. They just want to build their dream house on it and just be left alone kind of thing. And so, yes, this would change that dynamic for them. You know, one of the things, and Christina can maybe correct me if I'm wrong, we do have ADUs, accessory dwelling units, that are allowed. I want to say we allow those outside the city limits. I'm not entirely sure. She's shaking her head no, I think. But
I will have to check. I'm not positive on that. I will check the code right now.
So it may be that as a duplex, it could take the shape of a main dwelling with like a mother-in-law apartment as part of it. But for the most part, I mean, to bluntly answer your question, is that would no longer be allowed just to build a single family home based on what we've proposed.
And one last follow-up, is that compliant with Measure 37?
Well, we're allowed to, yeah, the short answer is yes. I mean, in terms of being compliant with Measure 37 and what evolved into Measure 49, when we, I'm not sure this is the perfect language about that, but when we remove somebody's property right, if we've diminished the value of their land and they want to make a claim against the city or the county, say, on the fact that we've diminished the value of their land, they could potentially try and do that. For them, my take would be that it would be pretty difficult for them to say, you'll allow me to build a duplex or a triplex or multiple dwellings on this, but not allowing me to build a single dwelling has devalued this land. But we are allowed to do that. The whole reason Measure 37 and ultimately Measure 49 came along was because that wasn't in place before. But now somebody does have an avenue through state law to make a claim against a government agency that they believe has taken a property right from them and devalued their land. So it may potentially set up a dynamic like that, and they would have recourse under those. It's not that we can't do it. It's just that those measures would now provide them a recourse to address it.
Anybody else from Lane County? Betsy, we can't see if you're raising your hand. Did you have any questions? Is Betsy still on? Perhaps not.
I think Commissioner Hadley had his hand up.
Yeah. A quick follow-up to that discussion. Your definition of duplex on in Exhibit A says 2 dwelling units on one lot or parcel in any configuration. Units may be attached vertically or horizontally or detached. It seems like that would be the loophole for single-family construction, right? As long as I put a kitchen in my attic, I've now got 2 units.
Essentially, you're correct. Yes, Commissioner, that is true. Or again, you could have a wet bar, essentially, or a kitchen in your pool house or in a detached garage that you convert into a dwelling unit. That's why I was kind of going down the road of talking about accessory dwelling units. That
which gets to the definition of kitchen. The way I read your definition of kitchen, the fish cleaning station on the side of my garage qualifies as a kitchen.
Yeah, part of the definition is that it's designed for the preparation of food. We get a lot of, that's a new definition. We don't have that in our code today. It is one of those points that it's hard to determine what is a dwelling and what is not.
Okay.
A lot of people want a second kitchen in their home as like a canning kitchen, or like you talk about having a fish cleaning station. The cooking facilities, make a difference. That definition was adopted from the city of Bend. I will just, and so we didn't write that definition from scratch, but a number of the code provisions we've proposed are adopted from other jurisdictions. But
well,
anyway.
I've been through all 625 pages and have annotations and questions on almost every page, and I'm not going to consume this meeting tonight with that. But I do have some, to me, serious questions about the annexation. procedures and policies and rules and regulations that you're proposing. First and foremost, why is the Planning Commission not involved in annexation decisions?
And I might defer to Christina Kraz. I'm not sure we're proposing to modify our annexation standards that are in place from what we have today, and annexations regulated under state law as well. But Christina, do you have a thought on that?
I don't know the history for why the Planning Commission does not provide a recommendation to the City Council regarding annexations, but that has been the City of Springfield policy as far back as I am aware, since they changed from the Lane County Boundary Commission procedures way back when. So they have always been a public hearing at the City Council level only, and I believe that's to more closely align with the process that's provided under state law for notices. But I don't know if that is precisely the reason, but that aspect isn't changing from the current process or procedure. So what would potentially be changing regarding annexations are the codes around how staff determine if an annexation application is complete or not, because the processes and procedures for determining if any application is complete are we hope becoming more clear. So, but otherwise the standards for annexation are not proposed to be changed.
And can you annex all the way to the limits of the urban growth boundary without expanding the UGB? Can you annex everything within the UGB and not expand the UGB itself?
That's that's ultimately the intent, is that everything inside the urban growth boundary would be annexed.
Okay.
The city doesn't initiate annexations. They're all property owner initiated annexations for the most part, other than publicly owned right of way and things like that.
But that's policy, that's not statute, correct?
It's informal city policy that the past and current city councils have expressed a extreme preference not to initiate annexations of properties. They retain that ability under state law, but we do not have there's not been an expressed policy interest in doing that for a long time by the Springfield City Council.
Okay, and then I had a couple of questions regarding rights of way and annexation.
Hey, Bruce, can I jump in just for a second?
Yeah.
I want to check with Chair McGinley. Do we want to take a couple of minute break before the public hearing? And if so, Bruce, maybe some of your questions. I realize you still have a lot of questions, and that's appropriate, but let's make sure we're considering timing here.
Okay.
I would defer to the commission. Commissioner Cuevila.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'd also let Mr. Hadley and others who have a large input that they'd like to give to staff, that to assemble those as a document and send it to staff as an email. That Mark's been very responsive to receiving stuff from commissioners in that fashion. Thank you.
So should my comments that are related more to policy, do you want me to keep my mouth shut until the public session is open? I mean, I understand. I'm certainly not going to bore you with every misplaced comment, a semicolon that should have been a colon in this meeting. And I can email that to you, Mark, separately. But the policy type questions, like how do you do annexations and what's right and wrong with annexations, do you want me to hold off until 7 p.m. on that?
I would say generally the intent of this work session was primarily to bring the planning commissions up to speed and get hopefully everybody somewhat on the same page. So to the extent you have detailed comments that other commissioners may want to have dialogue about, I think those may be more, and then also then give the opportunity for the public to potentially comment on if the record's left open, that type of thing. So not that you can't ask the questions now, but they may be more appropriate for the public hearing session, but we have a few minutes left. So if nobody else, or anyway, and I just will mention, the initial direction from our city council was to remain policy neutral in this code update. again, the annexation process is one that we're not proposing to drastically modify. Christina mentioned the deeming a annexation application complete or not is one area that might slightly change based on our completeness review procedures. But for the most part, you know, our city council sets the policy for what happens inside the city limits. They directed us not to make changes that would change established policy. Again, with the implementation of middle housing, we had to adjust on that dynamic because the state laws were forcing us essentially to change policies. Density is one of those kind of policy issues that we're having to adjust to implement middle housing. But anyway, for whatever that's worth, I do just on the annexation point want to just raise that we have increasingly had a number of annexations being requested by property owners that we refer to as emergency annexations. That's not really a formal term, but it's because their septic systems have failed and they, through the county, may not have the opportunity to repair or replace. A lot of these properties are urban levels of density where, you know, it's a house with a backyard. The drain field takes up the whole backyard. And when that fails, there's not a new place to put a new drain field. There's the dynamic of also being within 300 feet of a sewer line. Under state law, if they're within that 300 feet, they have to connect a sewer if their system fails. So we've been increasingly processing more and more of these emergency annexations that are very time sensitive to be able to get these houses to be habitable and not be basically condemned because they don't have any sanitary system.
Mark, all the stuff you're talking about is exactly why I am on the Lane County Planning Commission.
Great.
Because my street was annexed as part of a cherry stem annexation.
Sure.
And the reason I would hold some of my comments for the public meeting is, even though you guys haven't changed the law, I think there are lots and lots of aspects of annexation law, mainly set by the state, you're correct, that the public's not aware of. That the city says, oh, we're not going to force annexation on anyone. But if there's a sewer line running down my street, that changes the dynamic of my property. So let's hold off for the public meeting. That's fine. You've given me good answers.
Sure. It sounds like we could take maybe a 3 or 4 minute break. I don't want to step on the chair's toes, but and then reconvene the public hearing.
I'm just looking for a general consensus to make sure there's no more questions. Okay, so it's 6:57. We will reconvene here, the same Zoom link at 7 p.m.